With all the talk about Titanfall 3 and the amazing community that has rallied around the thought, the premise, the hope that the Titanfall franchise will continue, I wanted to take a second and look back in retrospect. Despite Call of Duty being incredibly hit or miss with its own community for over a decade, it never really has given up that top spot in the mainstream console FPS world. It hasn't. But that's not to say nobody has tried to dethrone it. Throughout the years, there have been a lot of new games and franchises developed with the explicit goal of taking Call of Duty off the top of the mountain. And if there was one that actually deserved to do it, I think it was Titanfall. The sci-fi FPS franchise debuted in 2014. It got off to a rocky start, but it peaked in 2016. And if you ask me, it deserved to become the top first-person shooter in the world. Unfortunately, a series of horrible circumstances kept it from ever getting even close to the success it was owed, and to this day, 7 years after its launch, we still have a lot of people across the internet begging the developers to make a follow-up. Welcome to the channel, everybody. Chaos here. Today, we are taking a deep dive into Titanfall 2. What made it so great, why it actually failed, and how much of an absolute tragedy it actually was. Be sure to let me know in the comments if you want a third Titanfall game. Drop a like on the video. Stick around for the entire one because this is going to be an absolute journey. Now, we can't talk about Titanfall 2 without talking about the minds behind it and where they actually came from. Titanfall was a brainchild of Respawn Entertainment, which is a studio whose formation was one of the hottest topics in the gaming industry in the early 2010s. It all started with Jason West and Vince Zampella, two ambitious game developers who had formed an Activision subsidiary called Infinity Ward, if you've ever heard of that little studio, back in 2002. Led the development of Call of Duty and many of its sequels. During the mid-2000s, Call of Duty absolutely exploded. It reshaped the first-person shooter genre and redefined console multiplayer for a whole new generation. The Modern Warfare subseries in particular made Call of Duty a household name. It also turned Infinity Ward into one of the gaming industry's main titans. No pun intended. But if you know anything about Activision, you know they can often find themselves in passionate disagreements with their studios. In the late 2000s, Infinity Ward was starting to learn that firsthand. Before we move on, guys, if you get anything from G2A.com, consider using code CHAOS to get some cash back. The link is at the top of the description. Now, following the insane success of Call of Duty 4, West and Zampella wanted to find a way to split their studio from Activision entirely. They wanted to cut off the big brother. Originally, the two struck a deal, with Activision giving them more creative freedom on the Call of Duty franchise, but Activision added in a clause in that new contract that stated if West and Zampella were ever fired, Activision would retain the rights to Call of Duty. Very smart on their part. You can probably imagine how a contract like that would lead to a pretty hostile environment, as Infinity Ward was fighting for more creative freedom, but if they messed up even a little bit, Activision would bring down the hammer and rip Call of Duty, the entire IP, away from them for good. So naturally, West and Zampella weren't satisfied with this being their work environment, and they quietly started weighing their options elsewhere. But this was unfortunately what caused everything to collapse. Jason and Vince were doing their best to find a way to make Infinity Ward independent, but when Activision found out that the two had actually met with other publishers to discuss possible contracts, they saw that as insubordination, and the dynamic duo was fired in March of 2010. Now, the following month, basically everything at Infinity Ward collapsed. A whopping 46 developers resigned in protest following the firing of West and Zampella, and within a few months, it was confirmed via LinkedIn that 38 of the 46 had signed on to new positions at a brand new studio called Respawn Entertainment. Less than a month after West and Zampella were fired from Infinity Ward, they had created a new studio called Respawn, and it seems once word got around to the rest of the Infinity Ward crew that their bosses had been busted for simply trying to stick up for them, it was the equivalent of them lighting the bat signal to start fresh somewhere else. Respawn received most of its initial funding through EA, who was eager to grab some new talent for a Call of Duty competitor. Of course they were. By E3 2011, EA was fully in Respawn's corner, openly promoting their new sci-fi-oriented first-person shooter that they were hoping would compete with games like Gears of War and Halo. Now, interestingly, early promotion for Titanfall never really compared it to Call of Duty, even though it was really clear to all of us that EA was hoping for their own COD equivalent. But then again, Titanfall was a mashup of various FPS ideas, despite the foundation being very inspired by Call of Duty. I guess EA was just trying to be casual about having their own Call of Duty, but the first issue with Titanfall was the fact that it was back in mid-2011. EA made a statement. They were holding on to Respawn's new game until they had an opportunistic window to release it. Release windows have never been Titanfall's friend, and that would eventually become the ultimate downfall of Titanfall 2, which we'll get into later. It's just a tad ironic that right from the beginning, EA was promising good release windows to an IP that they would eventually completely doom with absolutely horrible release windows. So, Titanfall 1 had a great foundation to its gameplay, was developed by a team of roughly 65 people. The mashing of Twitch-based Call of Duty-style gunplay with the giant mech-based combat arenas, it was unique, and the inclusion of tons of AI-controlled grunts on the battlefield made everything feel a lot more epic at that time and a lot more exciting. But all was not well with Titanfall 1, because EA got a little too excited about having their own Call of Duty competitor, and they ended up getting a little too greedy with their business tie-ins. For starters, they signed a deal with Microsoft to make the game an Xbox console exclusive, which was a massive problem for a number of reasons. First of all, the Xbox One got off to a disastrous start in 2013 following its initial reveal. Most of the gaming community saw the Xbox One as a laughingstock due to the horrendous E3 reveal that promised things like always online requirements and the mandatory Kinect camera that could not be unplugged. Sure, Microsoft eventually walked all those things back, but the Xbox One had a rough start. So Titanfall being an Xbox console exclusive didn't do it any favors. But the other major issue with Titanfall being an Xbox exclusive was the fact that most of the Call of Duty community had hopped over to the PS4 at this time. I still remember, I don't remember if it was Black Ops 3 or which one it was, but PlayStation delivering us new PS4s when we were at the Call of Duty event. They were in our hotel. It was absolutely insane. And then right before that or right after that, we were at the Titanfall 1 reveal event. It's just crazy, crazy times. It really was. Following the launch of the PS4 and the Xbox One, Sony struck up a deal with Activision for a lot of exclusive Call of Duty perks, including the professional circuit. And that was on top of the fact that the PS4 was already outselling the Xbox 3-1. And that was due to Microsoft's horrible E3 presentation we talked about. This meant the vast majority of the Call of Duty community did not own an Xbox One at the time that Titanfall 1 was coming out. And since EA was banking on the COD community rallying around this new game, you can see how that put a massive dent in the sales and the strategy. Now, another major issue with the first game was the fact that it was a full-priced $60 game despite only being multiplayer. The first game didn't really have a single-player campaign, nor did it have any offline bonus modes like a Horde, a PvE mode, nothing like that. You were paying $60 full price for the online multiplayer, and there was a big hefty season pass slapped on top of that. The early 2010s were the era of full-price multiplayer-only games, and Titanfall being attached to that trend put yet another dent in its reputation before most people even tried it. So when Titanfall 1 launched, it was praised for its gameplay, the unique combat, but it was heavily criticized for the pricing model and the exclusivity. Had it launched on every platform at $30 instead of $60, it could have been one of the biggest games of the decade, honestly. Instead, it was a giant swing and a missed opportunity. But that doesn't mean it was all bad. Titanfall was still a financial success for Respawn and EA, and it certainly put Respawn Entertainment on the map. A sequel was quickly greenlit, and the studio was determined to fix all of their mistakes with the follow-up. Now we arrive at Titanfall 2. Titanfall 2's development team was increased from 65 people to 90, and the production began in mid-2014. It gave the game 2 years to go gold. If you don't know what going gold means, it means on disc, ready to ship. Right from the start, Respawn wanted to address the first game's two main criticisms, those being the Xbox exclusivity and the lack of single-player content. The single-player campaign was intended to be kind of like a buddy cop movie with the main dynamic between the human pilot and his mech partner BT, while the game design was heavily inspired by Valve games like Half-Life and Portal, meaning the main story would be framed around a mystery and the level design would encourage players to find their own way to the endpoint as opposed to just pulling them along a singular linear path on rails. The multiplayer also greatly expanded upon. It was, thanks to the feedback from the first game, colors were made brighter, better visibility, more movement mechanics were added, increased the speed, the skill gap. The maps were made a bit more predictable to increase engagement and reduce frustrating random deaths. The Titans, they were also redesigned to make it easier to tell the classes apart from one another and add a bit more push and pull to the combat system. Respawn poured their heart into this game. They poured their heart and soul into Titanfall 2, and apparently there was even a VR version prototyped, but it never made it to full production because of, let's be real, how vomit-inducing it actually was, which does make sense to me. So every single change made to Titanfall 2's gameplay made it a better game from its predecessor. They're on the right track, right? And there's a reason why so many people consider it to be one of the best first-person shooters of all time. But you say, how can you consider it to be one of the best first-person shooters all time, and we're going to talk about its failure? How do those two go together? I mean, well, we'll see. The movement was amazing. The gameplay was addicting. The story was awesome, replayable. By all means, should have been one of the biggest games of the decade again. So what happened? Well, some of Titanfall 2's issues fell on the lap of EA, while others fell on the lap of hackers that kept it from being enjoyed by anyone other than themselves. So as many of you probably know, EA's release date decision for Titanfall 2 was almost hilariously bad. Remember what I said earlier about how EA was dedicated to finding an opportunistic release window for Titanfall? Well, Titanfall 2 was released in between Battlefield 1 and Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, just a few weeks after Gears of War 4, which was perhaps the worst decision anyone ever made in regards to a release window. Battlefield 1, one of the most anticipated games of the year. And while Infinite Warfare didn't have a lot of hype surrounding it, it's still a Call of Duty game, so it's going to soak up sales. Titanfall 2 had a lot to prove. It needed a relatively uncontested release window in order to prove those points. Instead, it was eaten alive by the gauntlet of competition. I mean, it sold an estimated 4 million units in its first 2 months, which was drastically lower than the 10 million that EA was projecting. It was not only a fan favorite, it was also one of the best reviewed games of the year. Tons of awards, accolades, despite its disappointing sales and the low player counts. The game was excellent, but it was at the wrong place at the wrong time. The sales and hype of Titanfall 1 was not nearly enough to make it worthy of competing against two giants like Call of Duty and Battlefield. Especially since this was the year that Battlefield was sending us back to World War I and Call of Duty was bundling a remaster of COD 4 with the new game. And Gears of War made its long-awaited comeback with the fourth main installment. It really didn't matter how good Titanfall was. It wouldn't compete. It couldn't compete. It just, wrong place, wrong time. 3 competing juggernauts. It was a horrendous decision. I'm honestly amazed that EA allowed it to happen, because if Titanfall 2 had launched in early 2017 instead, it would have cleaned house. Plus, it would have given Respawn a few more months to beef up the game's security, which leads us to the other main reason for the game's failure. Titanfall 2 may have flopped at launch, but it could have come back to life with time. There have been plenty of games that launched on the wrong foot. They all launch on the wrong foot now, but then managed to become huge successes. Just look at Sea of Thieves, No Man's Sky, Fallout 76, and millions of other examples. But unfortunately, we can't have nice things in this world, because Titanfall 2 had a huge hacking problem that kept it from ever being able to maintain a healthy player base. Following the failure of Titanfall 2's launch, the support team was reduced to the point that Respawn even admitted at one point there was only 1 or 2 people maintaining the servers, at 99% of the team had transitioned to Apex Legends, and that's just not going to work. This meant hackers were able to run around basically uncontested and perform some of the most obnoxious attacks on a video game I've ever seen. Hackers were constantly knocking people offline, overloading the servers with DDoS attacks, and even got to a point that the massive community effort called Save Titanfall was initiated to essentially do battle with the hackers that were making the game unplayable. See, when a game has thousands and thousands of people playing it, a handful of hackers aren't too hard to avoid. But in the case of Titanfall 2, where the community was rather small and there was only a handful of game lobbies running at any given time, that small number of hackers could quite literally make the game unplayable for everyone. After a massive community investigation that included a 40-page document of everything wrong, it was discovered there were some key oversights in the game's security that essentially allowed hackers to break the entire multiplayer. But again, since there was only 1 or 2 people maintaining the Titanfall 2 servers at that point, it was a lost cause. I mean, it was, despite the community quite literally spelling out what was wrong with the game and telling Respawn exactly what needed to be fixed, there simply weren't enough people on Titanfall 2's team to make a difference. And since the game wasn't making any money for Respawn or EA, they weren't going to allocate any additional resources. Titanfall 2 was literally left to rot, despite being one of the best games of the decade. Not only did this masterpiece of a game get the worst launch window in gaming history, it also lost any chance for long-term success because of the key security oversights that neither EA or Respawn have been willing to fix. So, what happens now? Apex Legends obviously isn't going anywhere, but the community has been begging for Titanfall 3 for years. It seems like there's always new rumors floating around about Respawn potentially working on it. Personally, I have mixed opinions. On one hand, I find it hard to believe that EA would ever greenlight Titanfall 3 due to all the money they lost in the first 2 games. Yes, Apex Legends made all that money back and then some. But when you look at the Titanfall franchise from the perspective of EA, it's almost impossible to justify them greenlighting a 3rd game. Titanfall 1 and 2 were both disappointments, so why make a 3rd, especially when Apex Legends is already doing everything the mainline games couldn't do? But then on the other hand, I think there's a decent chance we get that 3rd game for a number of reasons. First of all, EA's not stupid. We like to think they are, but they're not. EA is absolutely aware of the community outcry for Titanfall 3, and Respawn themselves have even acknowledged it on multiple occasions. They know there's a ton of people who would buy Titanfall 3, and assuming they don't make the same release window mistake again, the game would supposedly be the best selling of the trilogy just by existing. But the main reason I think Titanfall 3 may actually be coming is the simple fact that EA is in a desperate need of premium shooters to compete with Call of Duty. Let's be real. Right now, Battlefield is dead. Star Wars Battlefront, dead, right? And Call of Duty is currently in the most vulnerable position it's ever been in. Modern Warfare 2 is bleeding players at a rapid pace, and Warzone 2 is currently being stomped by Apex according to Steam charts, and now we get the leaks that this year's COD is Modern Warfare 3. Call of Duty's position at the top of the console FPS market could very easily be challenged by some other premium shooters, and with Apex doing all the marketing for Titanfall 3, EA could have a massive hit. At this point, everyone knows just how much Titanfall 2 got screwed over by its release window and the lack of continued support. But if Titanfall 3 were to drop, I think it would be a different story. I think EA realizes that. They need something to compete with Call of Duty. But with all their other shooter franchises kind of in the toilet, this may be it. This may be the perfect timing. The moons may align. The planets may come together for the trilogy to finally be completed. So my thoughts are this. Will we ever get Titanfall 3? I am conservatively, hopefully optimistic. It makes sense to happen. You just have to have the right people at the top, really have the clarity to see what the community wants and actually push through. I have faith in Respawn. I just don't have as much faith in EA. Let me know your thoughts, everybody. Let me know if you enjoyed Titanfall 2, and let me know if you enjoy these retrospect type of videos. If you do, let me know some other topics you would like me to visit. I'll see you guys soon.